So we've talked about how an exponential organization gets started. We've talked about the characteristics of it. We've talked about ExOs and how you apply them to a mid-market environment that's kind of stalled and you want to re-explode it. What we'll now delve into is maybe the heart and the core of this paradigm shift, which is how do existing organizations juxtapose with this new reality, right? For us, as we wrote the book, the analysis and examination of what an ExO is was one thing, but the more interesting part is how do you react to it? And certainly for existing businesses, this starts to become a very big question. We mentioned in the implications section that ExOs are launching products and services with almost no marginal cost, right? When Waze gets a new user, it adds to their supply and to their demand, which is why these companies are exploding out of the gate as we're seeing over the last few years. And so the question for existing businesses is how do you juxtapose with that? Now, there are several characteristics of existing organizations that cause a problem to adapt to this new world. The first is most of the conversation and discussion about large organizations is happening inside and about the company. When I was at Yahoo, my role was to run Brickhouse, its incubator, but also interface with the existing startup world and make sure we were properly positioned within the Yahoo, the mothership. And to my surprise, within about 6 or 8 weeks of taking on the role, I found I functionally could not do my job of being connected to the startup world. I found after a month or two that I literally lost touch with the startup environment. And the reason was I was doing so much quarter pounding to keep my team protected, to navigate the intricacies and complexities of Yahoo or any big company, that I simply lost touch with the outside world, right? And it was a real shock, and I realized that most of the conversation inside a large organization happens about the large organization, not what's happening outside. And that worked okay when the outside world wasn't changing very much or very fast, but it doesn't work today when the external environment is changing so radically. We've seen the statistics of how the average lifespan of an S&P 500 company used to be 67 years old. Today it's 15 years old, and actually now it's down to 12 years old. And so the metabolism of the economy is accelerating, and therefore large organizations need to now keep a new eye and keep a set of eyes on what's happening outside and have as much attention directed towards outside the organization as they do inside the organization. Even a company like Google, which has really super smart engineers, the sheer fact, for example, most of the Google engineers don't know what's happening in our world, in our singularity world with these accelerating technologies, because they're spending all their time coding and getting some stuff done, right? And the actual reality is that somebody today in a busy environment is working so hard just executing, they don't have time to look outside. And this is part of the issue that large organizations have. So there's 3 fundamental characteristics of this issue. First, that most conversation is happening inside and about the organization, not about what's happening outside. The second is when big organizations innovate, they look at their existing R&D or technology expertise. They don't look at the adjacencies. They don't look at orthogonal impacts of information. And this is another secondary aspect of it. And the third is they rely on innovation from within. Most large organizations say, okay, I've got an R&D department, they will figure it out, they're on the cutting edge of what's going on, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we also know today that the R&D function of any organization gets out of date pretty quickly. A really great example of this is Rob Nail, who's our CEO at Singularity University, came to our second executive program, and Rob had spent 10 years building a robotics company in the biotech space. He visited every corporate lab in the world in that environment and had a very successful exit. When he came to Singularity, he found to his shock that he learned more about robotics and more about biotech in a half a day than he did with 10 years visiting corporate labs. And this really stunned him as to how the heck could he go so out of date so quickly. And the reason is that today it's not just robotics, it's not just biotech, it's about how DNA synthesis is impacting the environment, how big data analytics is impacting your environment, how 3D printing may be impacting your environment. And so to keep up to date with all of the orthogonal effects of these technologies is part of the issue today. And so looking at the adjacencies is the third issue that big organizations have. Now, they can't just sit around, they have to do something, right? And we have this interesting discussion now about what do big organizations do. And what we'll do now is look through and come up with the recommendations as to what does an existing organization do in the face of exponential organizations. How do you adapt to that? Now, importantly, when I talk about large organizations, I'm not talking about 50,000 people plus or 10,000 people plus. I'm talking about kind of 500 people and more. We consider that a large organization, right? Because you've had to put in all of the processes and systems and the internal authorization clearances and stage gate product development to really navigate and scale and get out to the marketplace with a kind of a seamless set of product and services. So kind of most existing mid-market companies on would fit in our characteristic of what we call a large organization. So what we'll do now is we'll delve into what do large organizations do in such an environment, because the environment is fundamentally changing, right? So in any large organization today, the senior management decides something, sends down instructions through the chain of command down to the coalface. They go off and execute. Insights and reports come back, and then the board acts on those insights. And you have three or three issues with this paradigm shift. And these issues were identified by Ramez Nam, who spent 13 years at Microsoft building a lot of the interesting products there. And he noticed that when you do this kind of slow process, A, it takes a long time. B, you have Chinese whisper going on. You have data at the bottom that gets filtered through a number of layers, and what arrives at the boardroom is almost nothing like how it started. And it also stops anybody from taking risk, and it stops the interesting insights that people in the middle might have from reaching the top, right? And so there's a fundamental disconnect and an impedance mismatch in terms of how large organizations work today and where this goes. Maybe the story for me that highlights this is actually not in the book, but I just really love this example. Rob Reinhardt was a developer on the East Coast of the US, and he found that he got annoyed that he had to stop coding to go eat, right? Typical developer. And when he went out to eat, spent an hour, he typically ate bad food. Now, one day he decided, well, why can't I buy a shake, like a protein shake that you might use for building muscle mass if you're weightlifting? Why can't I buy a shake that would have a perfect complement of all the vitamins, nutrients, minerals, carbohydrates, fats that a human being needs, and not have to go out to eat bad fried food? And so he researched the marketplace and found there just isn't one. Nobody's created that. And so he worked with nutritionists and biochemists over several months and came up with a formula that is a perfect 100% complement of what a human being needs. Now, he's started to consume that and started to sell it. There are now thousands of people that are using this product. If you are an existing food company, you need to be kind of seriously worried about this, right? Because all of a sudden, here's an upstart whose product may actually displace your market, and the quick pop out for lunches or quick pop out to the grocery store for a ready meal might be really affected if this paradigm takes hold. In typical EXO fashion, Rob's product called Soylent has been open source. So anybody can take the formula, download it, and create a variation of it. There are already 1,500 variants of Soylent out in the marketplace. And there are journalists who've now lived for like several months without consuming literally anything else. And they've lost a ton of weight, they're way healthier because they're only taking exactly what that human body needs. So there's a little example of how an entrepreneur with a big mission can really affect how large organizations can act. And we saw this also with the example of Eric Mijakowski with the Pebble Watch. We used the crowdfunding example where he got funding for his Pebble Watch. Last Christmas, the Pebble Watch outsold Samsung in Best Buy. Okay? So a company that's 2 years old with Eric Mijakowski having no experience in the consumer electronics space outsells the biggest company in that space in the biggest retailer in that space, right? This is a fundamental inflection point in business. That was never possible in the world before, and now we're seeing it repeatedly. And so the big question will be, if you're an existing organization, how do you deal with the Eric Mijakowskis? How do you deal with the Rob Reinhardts? How do you juxtapose with that? And what we'll do now is delve into what are the transformations that a big company needs to make to adapt to this new environment. All right, so we've talked about how large organizations, the fact that they absolutely need to adapt. Now there are two vectors that large organizations use in the past to deal with this rapidly changing environment. The first is they try and protect their environment. They use regulatory capture, they'll lobby for regulations to create a moat around their organization to then give themselves a longer life cycle for their set of products or services. And this is an old tactic. The beef industry, the car industry, the discussion between Tesla and the car dealerships is a fascinating example of this conflict. There's an incredible irony to the fact that car dealerships are jumping up and down saying they're all about consumer protection. Maybe the epitome of this is the copyright laws, where Disney every 20 years lobbies heavily to extend copyright and eerily seems to follow the age of Mickey Mouse. Definitely not in the public good, but it's very good for Disney if they can manage to hold on to copyright for their key characters in that sense. So this has been a standard tactic over the past. What's interesting about today is that tactic no longer becomes that useful in the future. And the reason that regulatory capture does not become an important part of the future is that today, by the time you pass legislation or even notice that you have to do that moat protection, that somebody's gone and gotten public acceptance before you can even move. So for example, the taxi commission and the taxi lobby just didn't notice Uber. Uber sprung out as a service, very quickly got public acceptance, and now the taxi commissions and the lobby around that is on the back foot, trying to get around the 8-ball of public. The public loves the service in most cases, and so how do you deal with that? Same thing with Airbnb and the hotel industry was caught completely off guard. So today, regulatory capture, which used to be a very viable tactic for protecting the market size of an existing company, becomes less important going forward. We think that's an important insight around how we think about this. The second aspect of this is the fact that the metabolism of the environment is accelerating, that anybody can go create a product or service and compete with you. And we mentioned Eric Majakowski, we mentioned Rob Reinhart with Soylent. By the way, if you want to go order Soylent today, there's a 5-month delay because there's so many back orders. Right? Great problem to have, and that's again a scaling problem for an ExO. So let's look at the 3 or 4 things a large organization should do. The first is you have to transform your leadership. The leadership of the company has to be aware that this is happening, and you need to refactor leadership of large organizations to deal with this new future. The second is that an existing organization cannot transform into this big new animal. It's too radical a change, and we'll talk about that. So what you need to do is partner with existing exponential organizations. The third is what we call Disrupt X. You have to start a disruptive innovation practice within your organization. And fourth, you have to look at the ExO tactics and the characteristics that we've identified so far in the book and implement a light version of those 4 areas. So those are the 4 things a large organization needs to do. Let's delve into each one of those in turn.